Edith Grayson stood in the middle of the dusty road leading to the stone ranch, her heart hammering so hard against her ribs that she could hear it in her own ears, louder than the wind that swept across the Wyoming plains in that October of 1882. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hands were shaking, and she had nothing left in this world except the desperate question burning in her throat. She had walked 3 miles from the edge of Caldwell Creek in boots that had worn through at the left heel, and every step had been a negotiation with her own pride. She had sworn, just 6 months ago, that she would never come back here. She had said it to his face in front of his ranch hands, loud enough that the horses in the nearest corral had spooked. She had said she did not need Charles Stone, did not want Charles Stone, would not accept a single thing from Charles Stone if he were the last man standing between her and ruin. And here she was, standing at the gate of his property with ruin at her back. She saw him before he saw her. He was coming out of the barn, pulling off a pair of leather-work gloves, his broad shoulders blocking the pale morning sun for just a moment as he stepped into the light. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had simply spent 6 months trying to make him smaller in her memory. His hat was pushed back from his forehead and there was a streak of something dark across his jaw. He stopped when he saw her. He did not move for 3 full seconds. Edith lifted her chin. She would not cry. She absolutely would not cry. Edith. His voice was low and careful, the way a man speaks when he is trying not to startle something wild. She pressed her hands together in front of her to keep them still. "I need to know," she said, and her voice only broke once, just at the very beginning of the sentence, which she thought was a small miracle given the state of her. "I need to know if your offer still stands." The silence that followed was the most terrifying silence of her life, stretching out across the dry grass in the morning light, and the 6 months of pride and anger and wrong decisions that lay between them like a canyon. Charles Stone looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes reading her the way he read weather, the way he read the land, the way she had always suspected he read her when she was not paying attention. "It never once stopped standing," he said quietly. And Edith Grayson, who had survived things that would have broken most women, who had crossed 1,000 miles to make something of herself in a territory that cared nothing for a woman alone, felt her knees very nearly give out beneath her right there in the dirt. But before any of that could be understood, before a single word of what stood between them could mean anything at all, you had to go back to the beginning. Back to the train, and the letter, and the terrible mistake, and everything that had unraveled in the months before Edith Grayson came home to a door she had slammed shut herself. It had started in Philadelphia in the spring of 1882, in a house that smelled of old wood and other people's grief. Edith had been 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had died of pneumonia in January, leaving behind a rented house, a modest collection of books, and a debt to the landlord that was already 2 months old. Edith had been teaching at the same school as her father for 3 years, making enough to keep them both fed and the fire going in winter, but not enough to cover what remained when he was gone. The school board had been sympathetic. The landlord had not. She had found the advertisement in the back pages of a newspaper her neighbor Mrs. Haverson had left on the front step, probably by accident, but Edith had come to believe it was something closer to fate. The advertisement was small, just 3 short lines. "Rancher in Caldwell Creek, Wyoming Territory, seeks capable woman of good character for correspondence, possibly marriage. References preferred. Write to C. Stone, Box 14, Caldwell Creek Post." She had stared at it for 2 days before writing the letter. She was not a romantic woman, or at least she had told herself that often enough that she had mostly come to believe it. She was practical, organized, and good with numbers. She could cook without burning anything. She could keep accounts. She could manage a household. She had done it for her father since she was 15. She did not write the letter because she imagined love. She wrote it because she had $42 to her name and a landlord who had made very clear that her remaining time in that house was measured in weeks, not months. The reply from C. Stone came 11 days later. It was handwritten, and she could tell immediately that the man was not accustomed to writing letters. The sentences were short and plain-spoken, with no attempt at elegance or flattery. He ran a cattle ranch of 400 acres north of Caldwell Creek. He had been running it alone since his partner, a man named Garrett, had left the territory 2 years prior. He was 30 years old. He was not a difficult man to live with, in his own assessment, though he acknowledged that this was the sort of thing a man could not fairly judge about himself. He was looking for a practical arrangement that might become something more if both parties found it agreeable. He was not asking for anything she was not willing to give. He would provide her with a room of her own and a fair wage for her work on the ranch, until such time as they both decided whether a more permanent arrangement suited them. It was the most honest letter Edith had ever received from a stranger, and she trusted it immediately for that reason. She wrote back. Over the next 6 weeks, they exchanged 7 letters. Each one taught her something new about Charles Stone, and each one made her slightly more certain that she was not making a terrible mistake. He had been born in Missouri, had come west at 19 with a man who turned out to be a liar about the quality of the land he was selling, had worked for 3 other ranchers before saving enough to purchase his own claim. He had gone to school through the age of 14, which was more than many men in the territory, and had continued reading on his own since then. He was not religious in a formal way but believed strongly in keeping his word. He had a dog named Colonel. He did not drink to excess. He had never been married. That last detail had surprised her. She told him so in her 5th letter. A man of 30 with a working ranch and a decent reputation in his town, she wrote with careful frankness, was not usually without a wife by choice. His reply to that took a little longer than usual. When it came, it was shorter than his previous letters. There was a woman, he wrote. She chose someone else. I have not been in any particular hurry since. The land takes most of a man's attention if he is doing it right. Edith had read that letter 3 times, and then she had put it in the small tin box where she kept her important documents, and she had told herself not to make any romantic assumptions based on a man's honesty about his past. She arrived in Caldwell Creek on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of May, stepping off the Union Pacific spur line with 1 trunk and 1 carpet bag, and the kind of composure that was held together almost entirely by stubbornness. Wyoming Territory in 1882 was not Philadelphia. The air was different, drier and sharper, and the sky was enormous in a way that she had not been prepared for. The town itself was modest. A main street with a general store, a post office, a livery, a saloon that looked like it was leaning slightly to the left, and a few dozen buildings clustered around it like they were all trying to stay warm. Charles Stone was waiting at the station. She recognized him before he said a word. He was exactly as she had somehow imagined him, tall and quietly steady-looking, with dark hair going slightly gray at the temples even at 30, and eyes the color of deep water. He held his hat in his hands and he looked at her the way she had described him looking at her that morning at the gate, like he was reading weather. She had the unsettling sensation that he saw more of her in that first moment than most people found in months of acquaintance. "Miss Grayson," he said. "Mr. Stone," she said. He took her trunk without asking and put it in the back of the wagon with an efficiency that suggested he was not interested in ceremony. She appreciated that. They drove the 4 miles to the ranch mostly in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. He pointed out 2 things on the way: the location of the nearest water well and the ridge to the north, where the cattle sometimes drifted if the fence line was not properly maintained. She noted both. He seemed to notice that she noted both, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not have said exactly what it shifted to. The ranch house was larger than she had expected. 2 stories, with a proper parlor and a kitchen that had a good iron stove and enough shelf space to actually organize things. Her room was on the upper floor, small but private, with a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. He had put a clean quilt on the bed and left a pitcher of water on the dresser. Those two details told her something important about him, and she filed it carefully away. Dinner that first night was venison stew that she cooked from the supplies he had laid in, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table and talked in the careful, measured way of two people who are both intelligent enough to know that first conversations are mostly about establishing territory. He asked about her father. She told him, simply and without excessive emotion, that her father had been a good man and a good teacher, and that she missed him every day. He did not offer any hollow condolences, which she also appreciated. He simply nodded and said he was sorry for it, and she believed him. He told her about the ranch's financial situation with the same frankness he had brought to his letters. The previous 2 years had been lean. There had been a particularly bad winter in 1880 that had killed a significant portion of the herd, and rebuilding had taken most of his savings. He was not in debt, which he was clearly proud of, but the margins were narrow. He needed someone who could manage the books, oversee the household, and potentially help expand the small kitchen garden that had been badly neglected. "I can do all of that," she told him. "I know," he said. "I could tell from your letters." She looked at him across the candlelight and thought that this arrangement was going to be either the best decision or the worst decision she had ever made. In the first month, Edith Grayson reorganized the ranch house from top to bottom, balanced the account books to discover that Charles was actually in slightly better financial shape than he believed because he had been keeping one set of figures wrong, established a proper kitchen garden with tomatoes, beans, squash, and 3 kinds of herbs, and learned to ride a horse competently if not gracefully. She also learned the rhythms of the ranch, which were governed entirely by the land and the animals and the seasons, and she found, to her genuine surprise, that she liked those rhythms. She liked the clarity of a life organized around real and necessary things. She also, to her considerable inconvenience, began to like Charles Stone very much. It happened gradually, which made it harder to defend against. It was not one dramatic moment but a long series of small ones. The way he always made sure the lamp in her room had fresh oil before she went up for the night. The way he listened when she spoke, fully and without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. The way he treated his ranch hands, 2 men named Billy Potts and an older fellow they all called Granger, with a straightforward respect that seemed entirely natural rather than performed. The way he sometimes came in from the fields with a book tucked under his arm, because he had gotten into the habit of reading for an hour out near the north fence line when the afternoon light was good. He was reading a volume of Dickens when she caught him at it one Thursday in June, and she had stood at the window watching him for a good 10 minutes before she realized what she was doing and made herself go back to the accounts. They had not kissed. They had not even come particularly close to it. The arrangement remained what it had been described as practical and respectful, with a warmth that neither of them openly acknowledged. She had told herself, firmly and regularly, that this was wise. She had come here for a practical reason. She was an employee of a sort in a trial arrangement. She did not have the luxury of romantic entanglement complicating what was otherwise a situation that was working. And then August arrived, and with it, the dark thing that changed everything. His name was Warren Gale, and he rode into Caldwell Creek on a horse that was too well bred for a man whose coat was that dusty. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning while Charles was out checking the south fence line, and he sat down at Edith's kitchen table and helped himself to coffee without being invited to do so. He was about 40, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and was now mostly just commanding, and he had a way of looking at a room that made Edith think of a man calculating the value of things he intends to acquire. "You must be the new housekeeper," he said, with just enough emphasis on the word housekeeper to make it offensive. "I am Edith Grayson," she said. "And you are Warren Gale." He said it like she should know the name. When she showed no reaction, something flickered behind his eyes. "I'm an old acquaintance of Stone's. We have some business to settle." Edith poured herself coffee, pointedly not refilling his. "Mr. Stone will be back by midday. You're welcome to wait." He did wait. And when Charles came back, Edith watched from the kitchen doorway as the two men stood in the yard and talked, and she could read the tension in Charles's back from 40 feet away, the tight set of his shoulders, the absolute stillness of a man who is working very hard not to show what he is feeling. Gail did most of the talking. Charles did very little. When Gail finally rode out, Charles stood in the yard for a long time before he came inside. He told her some of it over dinner, which she had learned was his way. He processed things quietly, and then told her what he had decided she needed to know. Warren Gale had been the partner. Not Garrett, who had left amicably, but an earlier partner, one Charles had never mentioned in his letters. A man he had gone into business with during his first year in Wyoming, when Charles had been 22 and inexperienced, and far too willing to trust a man who offered him what looked like a helping hand. Gale had taken money from their shared account and then left, leaving Charles with a debt and a bad reputation with the Territorial Land Office that had taken him 4 years to clear. Gale had never paid back a cent of it. "And now he wants something," Edith said. "He says he has a legal claim to a portion of this land," Charles said, "based on a document he claims we both signed in 1872. "Did you sign it?" Charles was quiet for a moment. "I signed something," he said. "I was 22 years old and I thought I was signing a supply agreement. I never read it carefully enough. That was my mistake." Edith set down her fork. "Do you have a copy of what you signed?" "I don't know, maybe. There might be something in the old account box in the barn." "Then that is the first thing we need to find," she said. He looked at her across the table, and for a moment she saw something in his expression that she was not prepared for, something that went well beyond gratitude, something that made her look down at her plate very quickly. They spent 2 evenings going through the old account box together, sitting side by side at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, sorting through 7 years of receipts and agreements and notes in handwriting that was Charles's own but younger, less settled. It was during those evenings that Edith became aware of something she had been carefully not acknowledging. She was happy, sitting at that table in the lamplight, working through papers with a man who trusted her judgment and listened to her thinking, and occasionally touched her hand when he was pointing to something in a document. She was happier than she had been in a very long time, possibly longer than she was willing to examine honestly. On the second evening, they found the document. It was not what Gale had claimed. It was a supply agreement, exactly as Charles had believed, with a clause that Gale had clearly inserted to look like a land share but which Edith could see, when she read it carefully with the eye of a woman who had handled her father's school board contracts for 3 years, was written in language that was vague enough to contest and almost certainly would not hold up to a territorial judge's scrutiny. "This is not a legitimate claim," she said. Charles read it again. "You're sure?" "I'm sure that it is worded to look frightening, but the actual legal language is full of holes. If you take this to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne with a lawyer, I believe you can have it dismissed." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to read contracts." He was looking at her and she made the mistake of looking back. "Edith," he said, and his voice was different, quieter and more careful. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you don't have to answer it any particular way." She felt her heart begin doing something inconvenient. "All right. Have you been content here?" She thought about lying. She thought about saying something safe and practical and arm's length. Then she thought about the fact that Charles Stone had never once been anything but honest with her, and she found she could not manage to be any less. "Very," she said quietly. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. "I would like," he said slowly, choosing each word with obvious care, "to make this arrangement permanent. I would like to ask you to stay, not as an employee, as my wife, if you could find it agreeable." Edith Grayson looked at Charles Stone, with his careful eyes and his Dickens book, and the way he always made sure her lamp had oil, and she felt something open up inside her that she had kept shut since she was old enough to understand that life did not hand things to women easily, and that hope was a thing you had to spend very carefully. "I would find it agreeable," she said. He smiled. It was a full smile, and it reached all the way into his eyes, and it was the first time she had seen it happen like that all at once, without reservation. They were married at the Caldwell Creek Courthouse on the 14th of September, 1882, by the Justice of the Peace, a man named Horace Webb who had a magnificent mustache and a habit of sniffling at ceremonies. Billy Potts and Granger stood as witnesses. Edith wore her best dress, which was blue wool, and Charles wore a jacket she had never seen before, dark and well cut, which made her suspect he had ridden into town at some point and purchased it without mentioning it. That detail moved her more than she could explain. She had kissed him then at the courthouse, when Horace Webb declared them properly wed, and it was nothing like the distant, polite thing she had imagined a practical arrangement might produce. It was warm and certain, and it tasted of the October that was coming, and she had held onto the front of his jacket with both hands and thought, completely against her own better judgment, that she was very thoroughly in love with this man. And then, 3 weeks later, the betrayal came. It did not come from Warren Gale, which was what she had been watching for. It came from Edith's own past, wrapped in a lie she had told by omission in her very first letter. A man rode into Caldwell Creek named Martin Foss. He was tall and thin, with a mean quality to his features that no amount of polite behavior could quite disguise. He went to the saloon first, and then to the general store, and the information he spread moved through a town the size of Caldwell Creek in approximately 4 hours, which was how long it took before Granger came to find Edith in the kitchen garden with a troubled expression that told her something terrible was happening before he even opened his mouth. "There's a man in town," Granger said carefully, "saying some things about you, Mrs. Stone. Figured you ought to know." She went inside and waited for Charles. What Martin Foss was saying was this. Edith Grayson, before she was Edith Stone, had been engaged to a man in Philadelphia named Robert Foss, who was Martin Foss's brother. Robert had given her a ring and a promise of marriage, and she had taken the ring and the promise and then, 4 months before the wedding, had broken the engagement and taken a position as a ranch hand's wife out west. And Martin Foss claimed the ring had never been returned. When Charles came home, Edith was already sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, because she had learned that the only thing worse than a hard conversation was making someone wait for it in the wrong way. "I know why you have that look on your face," she said when he came in, "and I want to tell you what is true before you hear anything else." He sat down. He waited. That was one of the things she loved about him, that he always let her speak. There had been an engagement. Robert Foss, whom she had known for 2 years through a church social group her father had encouraged her to attend. She had accepted his proposal because it had seemed like the sensible thing to do, because she was 22 and he was stable and kind enough on the surface, and because her father had been quietly worried about her future in the way fathers worry when their daughters are practical and unmarried. She had not been in love with Robert Foss. She had known this almost from the beginning, and she had convinced herself it did not matter, that love was something that grew from compatibility and shared life. And then she had understood, 6 months into the engagement, that Robert Foss had a temper that he hid in public and revealed only in private. Not violent, she was careful to clarify, not in any physical way, but the kind of cold, consuming anger that controlled and diminished. The kind that would have made her smaller and smaller over time until there was nothing left of her that was truly herself. She had broken the engagement. She had returned the ring. Whatever Martin Foss was claiming about the ring was either a lie or a misunderstanding of what had become a very unpleasant confrontation when she had returned it. She had the letter she had written Robert at the time, giving it back if he wanted to see it. She kept almost everything. "I should have told you," she said. "In my letters, I should have included it." Charles was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid," she said, and it cost her something to say it plainly. I was afraid that a man advertising for a practical arrangement might see a woman with a broken engagement as a liability, a sign of bad character or instability. And I knew as clearly as I know my own name that ending that engagement was the right thing to do. I did not want to have to justify it in a letter to a stranger before I had a chance to be known. He looked at her for a long time. "Do you have the letter?" he said finally. "Yes." "Then we will show it to Martin Foss and he can take his false story back where he found it." She had expected more, some accusation of deception, some coldness that she would have deserved. Instead he got up, refilled his coffee and said, "What kind of man follows a woman 1,000 miles to harass her over a ring she returned?" "The vindictive kind," she said. "Or a man with a hidden motive," he said. That was when she understood that Charles was thinking more clearly than she was, because he was right. Martin Foss's arrival in Caldwell Creek at exactly the time when Warren Gale was already pressing a dubious land claim was not, when you thought about it, a coincidence. They found the connection 3 days later. Martin Foss and Warren Gale had been seen together at the saloon in Rawlins, 80 miles east, 2 weeks before either of them arrived in Caldwell Creek. They had been overheard discussing a ranch, overheard by a man named Pete Aldrich who ran the livery in Rawlins and had no reason to lie and every reason to be curious. The plan, as best Edith and Charles could reconstruct it, was to use the threat of the land claim to pressure Charles into a cheap sale, and to use the scandal around Edith's past to make her an unreliable witness if the matter went to court, since a woman who had broken an engagement and been accused of keeping a ring would have her testimony doubted by any territorial judge in Wyoming. It was a cruel plan, and it was not quite clever enough, because they had not accounted for Edith. She wrote to the Philadelphia Register that same week, a newspaper whose editor she knew from her father's acquaintance, and asked him to make inquiries about Robert Foss and the circumstances of the broken engagement. She wrote a separate letter to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, requesting clarity on the legal standing of the document Gale had produced. She wrote a third letter to the Justice of the Peace in the county where Gale had first filed his claim, asking for a copy of all relevant documents. And then she and Charles waited. But waiting, it turned out, had a cost that neither of them had anticipated. Because the doubt that Martin Foss had seeded in Caldwell Creek did not need to be true to be damaging. People in a small town with a slow winter coming did not need evidence. They needed something to talk about, and a new wife with a hidden past was plenty. She began to feel it in the way the woman at the general store, Mrs. Patton, spoke to her, not rudely exactly, but with a new careful quality, a slight pulling back. She felt it when Billy Potts came to work one morning without quite meeting her eyes, and she understood that someone had been talking to him. She did not tell Charles about those things. She handled them herself, with the particular form of dignity that women in hard situations have always had to develop, the kind that looks like calm from the outside and costs a great deal more than anyone knows. But what she did not handle well, what she was ashamed of later, was the evening in late October when Charles came home from town looking tired and grim, and she saw something in his face that she misread entirely. "What happened?" she asked. "Gale was at the saloon," he said, talking. "Telling anyone who would listen that the marriage was a mistake, that I didn't know who I'd married." She felt something go cold in her chest. "And what did you say?" "I said that I knew exactly who I had married," he said, "and that any man who suggested otherwise was welcome to take it up with me directly." There was a pause. She looked at him, and what she saw, or what she thought she saw in her fear and exhaustion, was a man who was enduring something. A man who was performing loyalty because he was a man of his word, but who perhaps was beginning to wonder what he had gotten himself into. She was wrong about that. She would understand later that she had been completely, disastrously wrong about it. But in that moment, in her fear and the accumulated weight of weeks of being looked at sideways in a town that had seemed safe, she heard it as confirmation of something she had been secretly afraid of all along, that she was a burden, that her past was a stone around his neck, that her presence was costing him something he could not afford to give. She made a decision that night that she would regret for 6 months. She told him the next morning that she wanted to leave. Not the marriage, she clarified when she saw his face. She was not speaking of divorce. That was not the kind of woman she was. But she believed it might be better for the situation, for his reputation in the town, if she were to go and stay for a time with her cousin in Denver, just until the matter with Gale and Foss was settled, just until the talk died down. She made it sound logical. She was good at making things sound logical. He had looked at her with something in his eyes that she could not read at the time and that she understood later was pain, quiet and completely controlled, the kind he was very good at holding perfectly still. "If that is what you want," he said. "I think it is best," she said. He did not argue. She had half wanted him to, she knew that now, but he was a man who respected her autonomy so completely that he could not bring himself to hold her back even when holding her back was exactly what she needed. It was, she thought later, both his greatest quality and the one that had almost cost them everything. She left on a Thursday morning. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she was protecting him. She told herself these things every day for the next 6 weeks, and they became less and less convincing as the weeks passed. Her cousin in Denver was a woman named Clara Whitmore, married to a druggist, who was kind enough but had 3 small children and a house that was full in every sense of the word. Edith slept in a room barely larger than a closet and helped with the children and thought about Wyoming every single day. She heard from Charles once, a short letter that told her the matter with Gale had progressed to the land office and that he had retained a lawyer named Aldous Clark from Cheyenne. He did not ask her to come back. He said the weather was turning cold. He said Colonel was missing her, the dog, and then seemed to realize that sounded like more than he had intended, because the next sentence was about the fence line again. She read that letter so many times the paper began to wear at the fold. In November, the response came from Philadelphia. The editor she had written to had made his inquiries. Robert Foss, it turned out, had been engaged a second time since Edith, to a woman in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and had broken that engagement himself, which rather undermined the narrative of Edith as the faithless one. The ring she had returned was documented in a letter she had written that Robert's own mother, apparently a woman of more integrity than her son, had kept and was willing to produce. Martin Foss, when confronted with this in Caldwell Creek by Charles and his lawyer Aldous Clark, had decided that Caldwell Creek was no longer the most comfortable place for him to be and had ridden out before Christmas. Warren Gale's claim took longer, because these things always took longer when there was an actual legal process involved. But the Territorial Land Office, reviewing the original document with the legal clarity that Edith had predicted months ago, dismissed the claim in December. Gale's fraudulent alteration of the supply agreement was documented and referred to the territorial court. He left the territory before he could be served papers and was, as far as anyone could determine, not coming back. By Christmas of 1882, Charles Stone's land was secure, his reputation was repaired, and his wife was in Denver. Edith received the news in a letter from Aldous Clark, the lawyer, who had apparently taken it upon himself to keep her informed, since Charles's own letters had become brief and infrequent in the way that a man's letters become when he is not sure what to say. She sat with that letter in Clara's small parlor with the children making noise in the next room and the smell of Denver in winter coming through the window, and she understood something with a clarity that she had been avoiding for weeks. She had run away, not from the town's gossip, which was what she had told herself. She had run away because she had been afraid. She had been afraid that Charles would eventually find her past too complicated, that the things she brought to the marriage were not equal to what he gave her, that she was not, in the quiet heart of her, enough. She had made a decision based on fear and dressed it up as practicality, which was, she thought, the most dishonest thing she had ever done in her life. More dishonest than omitting the engagement from her initial letter, because at least that omission had been about protecting her future. This one had been about punishing herself for something she had not actually done. And in running, she had left a man who had defended her name in a saloon, who had hired a lawyer and fought a fraudulent land claim, who had written her that Colonel was missing her, and then clearly been embarrassed by his own honesty, alone on a ranch in Wyoming in the middle of a cold winter. She packed her trunk the next morning. She told Clara she was going home. Clara, who was a perceptive woman even if her house was very loud, looked at Edith over the children's breakfast and said simply, "It's about time." The train from Denver to the Caldwell Creek Spur line took 2 days. Edith spent both of them thinking about what she would say and discarding every version of it, and eventually arriving at the understanding that what Charles Stone valued, what he had always valued in every letter and every conversation and every interaction they had ever had, was honesty. Not eloquence, not a perfectly constructed explanation. Honesty. She was going to walk up to the gate of the Stone Ranch, and she was going to ask him plainly if his offer still stood. She was going to do it even if it cost her everything that was left of her pride, because what she was risking by going back was so much smaller than what she was risking by staying away. It was a cold morning in January of 1883 when the train arrived at Caldwell Creek. The platform was mostly empty, just the station master and a boy loading freight. Edith stepped off with her trunk and her carpet bag and the boots with the worn-through left heel because she had not wanted to spend the money on new ones in Denver, and she hired a boy with a wagon to take her trunk to the station office to hold, and then she walked the 4 miles to the Stone Ranch in the clear, biting winter air. She saw him come out of the barn. She watched him stop. She asked her question. He told her it had never once stopped standing. And then Charles Stone walked across the 30 feet of dirt between them, and he put both his arms around her, right there in the open where Granger and Billy Potts could see from the fence line, and she pressed her face against the front of his jacket and breathed in the familiar smell of him, cold air and leather and wood smoke, and she thought that she was never in her life going to be foolish enough to leave this again. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice muffled by his jacket. "I am sorry I ran. I was afraid. I was afraid I was a burden and I made a coward's choice and dressed it up as a sensible one." His arms tightened around her. "You are the least cowardly person I know," he said. "And you were never once a burden. I left you alone in winter. I had Colonel." She laughed, startled out of it, and felt him laugh too, quietly against her hair, and it was the best sound she had heard in 6 months. They went inside and she made coffee, because making coffee was something her hands knew how to do when the rest of her was still finding its footing. He sat at the kitchen table and watched her, and it felt so exactly right that it made her chest ache. "I want to say something to you," she said, setting his cup in front of him, "and I want you to let me finish before you say anything." "All right," he said. "I love you," she said, with the same careful plainness she brought to everything important. "I am in love with you, Charles. I have been since sometime around July, which I suspect you may have noticed before I did. And the reason I left was not because I doubted you. It was because I doubted that I deserved what you were giving me. And that was my problem, not yours, and I should have talked to you about it instead of constructing an elaborate practical justification for doing something that was purely frightened. That is the whole truth of it." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "July. Probably July," she said, "perhaps late June." "I should tell you," he said slowly, "that in my first letter to you, when I described myself as not a difficult man to live with, that was, in retrospect, a fairly significant understatement of what I was actually hoping." She looked at him. "I had read your letter," he said, "and I had thought, this is a remarkable woman, and I spent 11 days deciding what to write back that would make a remarkable woman want to come to Wyoming." She stared at him. "You spent 11 days on that letter." "I wrote 6 drafts." She felt something warm unfold in her, a tenderness so large she was not sure she could contain it properly. "You told me you had difficulty writing letters." "I have difficulty writing bad letters," he said. I was very specifically trying not to write a bad one." She sat down across from him and looked at him in the winter light coming through the kitchen window, and thought that she had made, against considerable odds and through a truly spectacular series of poor decisions, the best choice of her life when she had written to a box number in Caldwell Creek, Wyoming territory. "I am not leaving again," she said. "I know," he said. "I'd drive you back to Denver myself before I let you walk 4 miles in those boots." She looked down. "They are a bit worn." "They are past worn," he said. "We're going to town tomorrow and getting you proper boots." She looked up at him, and he was looking at her with that expression she had been collecting, the one that showed up in particular moments when he forgot to keep it entirely to itself, and she reached across the table and took his hand. "All right," she said. January in Wyoming was cold in a way that demanded constant attention, and there was always work, always fence line to check and cattle to manage, and the 1,000 small things that a working ranch required in the depths of winter. But there was also, now, the particular warmth of two people who have come back to each other, after a separation that taught them both what they were risking by being apart. Edith moved through the work of the ranch with a lightness she had not had before, and she noticed, watching Charles, that his shoulders had lost something they had been carrying, a tightness that she recognized now as worry he had not shown her while it was happening. She found out in February from Granger, who was not a man given to unnecessary speech, but was occasionally moved to say important things in very few words, that Charles had spent the week she was in Denver in a state of what Granger described as considerably less peaceful than usual. That he had saddled his horse twice and ridden halfway to the train station and turned back both times because she had said it was what she wanted and he would not override what she said she wanted. She told Charles what Granger had told her. Charles gave Granger a long, speaking look. Granger, unrepentant, went back to feeding the horses. "You turned back twice," she said. "You said you wanted to go. I was wrong about what I wanted." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have argued," he said. "I thought I was respecting your decision, but I think I was also afraid." "Of what?" He looked at her, and there was something in it that she understood took him a real effort to say. "Of being the kind of man who keeps a woman somewhere she doesn't want to be. I have known men like that. I never wanted to be one." She crossed the kitchen and put both her hands on either side of his face, something she had not done before, something that felt exactly right in the way that some things feel entirely inevitable in retrospect. "Listen to me," she said. "There is a very large difference between keeping a woman somewhere she doesn't want to be and asking a woman to reconsider a decision she made out of fear. You can always ask me to reconsider. You are my husband. I want you to ask." He covered one of her hands with his. "Noted," he said. "Good," she said. Spring came to the Stone Ranch with the kind of extravagance that Wyoming reserved for people who had survived its winters. The pastures greened with a thoroughness that seemed almost apologetic, and the air lost its teeth and became something mild and clean, and full of the sound of the creek running high with snowmelt. Edith planted the kitchen garden again, expanding it significantly from the previous year, adding potatoes and 2 rows of sunflowers along the fence, because she had discovered over the winter that she liked having something beautiful near the house that served no particular practical purpose. Charles had raised his eyebrow at the sunflowers. She had told him they were for Colonel, who liked to sit near them. He had said Colonel was a cattle dog and did not have aesthetic preferences. She had said he did not know Colonel as well as he thought. Charles had planted 2 more rows of sunflowers without saying another word about it. She found this to be one of the best things about him. In April, Edith discovered she was expecting a child. She told Charles on a Sunday evening when the work was done, and the supper things were cleared and they were sitting in the parlor, him with his Dickens and her with the account book, which was a slightly absurd domestic scene that she had come to love unreservedly. She said it plainly as she said everything important, that she was fairly certain she was expecting a baby by her calculations sometime in November, and that she was both nervous and very happy about it. He set down his book. He looked at her. And then he smiled, the full smile, the one that reached all the way into his eyes. "November," he said. "Give or take a few weeks." He came across the parlor and sat beside her on the settee and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him in the easy way that had become natural over the months, and they sat for a long time looking at the fire. "We'll need to add a room," he said eventually. "We do have a second room upstairs that is currently functioning as storage," she said. "I'll clear it in May. I can help clear it." "You can supervise," he said. She thought about arguing. She decided to let it go on this particular occasion. He cleared the room in May, and she supervised, mostly by sitting on a crate in the hallway and handing him opinions about which direction things should be moved. He accepted approximately 40% of her opinions, which she felt was a reasonable ratio. Billy Potts, who had a younger sister and had therefore acquired some opinions of his own about what babies required, contributed advice about the placement of the window shade, which turned out to be good advice, and which Edith told him so directly, which seemed to please him considerably. The summer of 1883 settled over the ranch with a generosity it had been somewhat reluctant to provide the year before. The cattle were doing well. The accounts were more solid than they had been since Charles first purchased the land, and Edith had begun supplementing their income in a small way by offering to manage the books for 2 other ranches in the area whose owners, she had determined, were doing several things numerically wrong, and were losing money they did not know they were losing. Charles had discovered this arrangement when he came home one afternoon to find a man from the neighboring Hartwell Ranch sitting at his kitchen table, going over figures with his wife. He had stood in the doorway for a moment and then gotten himself a cup of coffee and stayed out of the way, and afterward he had said, "You're becoming the best bookkeeper in Caldwell Creek." "Someone has to be," she had said. "Are you charging them properly?" She showed him the rate she was charging. He thought about it and said she should charge 15% more. They negotiated it down to 10% more, and she increased her rate accordingly. In September, 2 months before the baby was due, Edith was at the general store in Caldwell Creek when she ran into something unexpected. Warren Gale's daughter. She had not known Gale had a daughter in the area. The girl was no more than 19, sitting on the step of the general store looking as though the whole world had failed her, which was a specific kind of expression that Edith recognized. Her name, she learned after sitting down beside her and asking, was Rose, and she had followed her father to Wyoming from Kansas 2 years ago, been abandoned by him when his schemes fell apart, and had been working at the hotel in Caldwell Creek since winter. Edith sat with her for a while on that step. She did not offer anything except attention, which was sometimes the more valuable thing. Rose told her about her father, about the pattern of his promises and his disappearances, about the way she had believed him one time too many. She was a quiet girl with good sense hiding under a year's worth of exhaustion and disappointment. Edith told her that she was looking for help at the house if Rose wanted regular work, good wages and a room of her own. Rose looked at her as though she was checking for the catch. "There is no catch," Edith said. "I am about to have a baby in November, and I am not going to be operating at full capacity, and I need someone reliable." "My father tried to take your land," Rose said. "Your father's choices are not your responsibility," Edith said. She brought Rose Gale home that afternoon, installed her in the cleared spare room that was meant for storage, and rearranged her plans for the baby's room accordingly, which was a small logistical inconvenience and absolutely the right thing to do. Charles, when she explained this to him at dinner, looked at her with an expression that she had catalogued as his, "This woman is going to rearrange my life for the better whether I am ready for it or not" expression. "She has nowhere else to go," he said. "She has the hotel, but the hotel is cold and the woman who runs it is not kind. Her room will need a proper fire. I know, the chimney flue in that room needs to be cleared before winter. Billy Potts can do it." He shook his head, but in the way that meant he had already decided she was right. "All right." Rose Gale turned out to be one of the better things that came into the Stone household that year. She was quiet and steady and learned quickly, and she was good with the animals in a way that surprised everyone including herself, since she had not grown up around livestock. Granger, who spent most of his time with the animals, began to have more conversation in his day than he was strictly accustomed to. By October, Edith had noticed that Granger took the longer route past the kitchen window at times when Rose was likely to be visible through it, and filed this information carefully for future reference. She was going to say nothing about it. She was going to let it develop entirely on its own, because some things needed room. The baby came in the second week of November, as she had predicted, with all the dramatic urgency that first babies seem to bring to their own arrivals. Charles had gone to fetch the midwife, a capable and entirely unflappable woman named Mrs. Brock, who arrived and proceeded to manage the situation with the authority of someone who had done this far too many times to be impressed by it. Rose was enormously helpful and entirely calm, which made Edith think even more highly of her. The baby was a boy. He was large and loud and had his father's dark hair, and he came into the world on a Tuesday morning with a conviction about his own existence that suggested he intended to make his presence known consistently. Charles held him in the big chair by the bedroom window, and Edith, exhausted and happier than she had words for, watched her husband hold their son with an expression on his face that was so unguarded she felt she had been given something private to witness. "Samuel," Charles said, which was the name they had agreed on in August. "Samuel," she confirmed and closed her eyes. Charles Stone, it emerged over the following weeks, was a father who treated the whole enterprise with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to the ranch. He was up at night without being asked. He was remarkably competent at the practical aspects of managing a small human, which surprised people who expected that a Wyoming rancher would leave all of that to his wife. He did not leave it to his wife, except in the specific matters for which he was biologically unsuited. Samuel acquired the habit of sleeping on his father's chest during the evening hours while Charles attempted to read, which required some adjustment in how books were held, but which he managed. Edith watched this and felt a fullness inside her that was so complete she sometimes had to just stop what she was doing and let herself feel it, because it seemed wrong to be busy, while something this extraordinary was simply happening in the room. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was colder than the previous one but better in every other sense. The ranch was financially solid. The house was warm. Samuel grew and became interested in everything within reach. Rose settled into the household with such completeness that it became impossible to imagine the house without her. And Granger, who had apparently decided that the thing he felt warranted action, began appearing at the kitchen door on Sunday evenings with various items he had thought might be useful to the household, but which, Edith observed, he delivered specifically when Rose was likely to be in the kitchen. In February, she finally said something. She said it to Charles, not to Granger, because it was not her business to manage another person's courtship. She said, "I believe Granger intends to court Rose." Charles looked up from Samuel, who was attempting to eat Charles's shirt collar. "Granger doesn't court. He is learning," she said. He looked thoughtful. "He's considerably older than her. She is 19. He is, 32? That is not a scandal." Charles considered this. "He's a good man." "He is an excellent man," she agreed, "and she could use one." What happened between Granger and Rose Gale after that proceeded exactly as Edith had hoped it would, which was to say slowly and with the characteristic restraint of a man who was not accustomed to saying personal things directly. But Rose was patient and perceptive in the way of people who have learned to read situations carefully out of necessity, and she was, Edith thought, genuinely fond of him. By spring, Granger had worked up to staying for Sunday supper when invited, and to bringing flowers on one occasion, which were slightly wilted from being carried in a saddlebag, but which Rose received as though they were perfect, which Edith thought showed excellent character on Rose's part. Spring brought the second year's planting, and Samuel learning to sit up and then to crawl with alarming speed across the kitchen floor, and the expansion of the ranch that Charles had been planning since winter. He had the opportunity to purchase an adjacent piece of land from a family named the Brodricks who were leaving the territory after a series of difficult seasons, and adding that land would significantly increase the ranch's grazing capacity. It required taking on some debt, which was the thing Charles was most reluctant about, having spent years getting clear of it. Edith reviewed the numbers for 3 days, and then presented him with a full analysis of the projected return over 4 years based on current cattle prices and the average performance of the land in the area. She had over the previous months become quite proficient at reading land productivity assessments, for reasons she declined to explain as anything other than curiosity, but which Charles suspected were entirely intentional. He read the analysis. He read it again. "You're recommending we buy it," he said. "I'm presenting you with an analysis that makes a strong argument for buying it," she said. "The decision is yours." "What would your decision be?" "I would buy it," she said. He bought it. The Brodrick land, 60 additional acres to the south, proved over the following 2 years to be as productive as the analysis had suggested. The debt was managed efficiently and was paid off ahead of schedule. Billy Potts took on expanded responsibilities and turned out to be a natural at managing the additional cattle, which Charles rewarded with an increase in his wages that made Billy's face do something very young and grateful that Edith found entirely touching. Samuel turned 1 in November of 1884, and had by then developed into a person with very clear opinions about most things, including the fact that he strongly preferred being outdoors to indoors, which meant that Edith spent a great deal of time the following spring supervising a small person who was attempting to investigate everything on the ranch that he had not yet investigated. Charles built a proper fence around the kitchen garden to protect it from both the cattle and Samuel, who had shown an interest in the bean plants that the bean plants did not deserve. In the spring of 1885, Edith told Charles she was expecting again. He received this information with the same expression he had received it the first time, the full smile, the unguarded one. He was also, she noted, slightly more measured about the practical implications this time, which she took as evidence that experience had given him a more complete understanding of what another small person was going to require of their days. "September," he said. "October, I think," she said. "I'll start on the extension for the bedroom wing in June," he said. She had been thinking about the bedroom wing since February. "I thought we might push it toward the east side of the house to get the morning light." He thought about this. "That adds to the cost. It also means the room is actually pleasant to be in." He considered. "The east side," he agreed. The second baby was a girl, arriving in October as Edith had predicted, with rather more drama than Samuel had managed, though she was smaller than her brother had been. She had Edith's gray eyes and Charles's dark hair and an expression, even at 2 days old, that suggested she was already forming opinions. They named her Clara, after Edith's cousin in Denver, who was enormously flattered by this and wrote back immediately to say that she was coming to visit as soon as she could manage it. Samuel, who was now 2 and very confident in the world, inspected his new sister with the solemn thoroughness of someone conducting an official investigation, and then declared her little, and went back to his own concerns. Rose, who was now firmly part of the household in every sense of the word, helped with Clara's first weeks with a warmth and steadiness that made Edith, more than once, quietly grateful for the afternoon she had sat down on a step outside a general store and asked a sad-looking girl her name. Granger and Rose were formally courting by this point, in the careful and proper way of 2 people who are both taking it seriously. Granger had asked Charles's permission to call on her, which had been given readily, and had begun saving money with the focused intensity of a man who had a specific plan in mind. Edith knew, because Rose had told her in a quiet evening conversation, that Rose had told Granger plainly that she wanted to be asked when he was ready, and that she was not going anywhere in the meantime. Granger had apparently found this statement the most reassuring thing he had ever heard in his life. He asked her in the spring of 1886. He did it on a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen garden, which Edith and Charles were careful to be not in at the time, having removed Samuel and Clara on the pretext of checking the south fence line, which everyone knew was not genuinely necessary at 3 in the afternoon on a Sunday. Rose said yes. The wedding was at the Caldwell Creek Courthouse, exactly as Edith and Charles's had been, with the same Horace Webb officiating and the same magnificent mustache and the same susceptibility to sentiment. It was April, and the plains were green in the extravagant way they could be for a few weeks before summer, and Rose wore a dress that Edith had helped her sew from fabric ordered from the catalog in Cheyenne, and Granger looked like a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune, which was exactly the right expression for a groom to have. Edith cried at the wedding, which she had not expected to do, and Charles gave her his handkerchief without comment, which she appreciated. Granger and Rose settled into a small house that Granger had built over the previous year on the western edge of the Stone Ranch land, close enough to be neighborly, but with enough distance to be properly independent. This arrangement suited everyone. Granger continued his work on the ranch, and Rose continued helping Edith several days a week, and they both clearly flourished in the quiet solidity of what they had made. Charles and Edith watched this with the satisfaction of people who have seen something good come from something that started in difficulty, which was, Edith thought, a fair description of most things that were worth anything. The years from 1886 onward settled into the rhythm of a life that was rich in the ways that mattered and occasionally demanding in the ways that working land always was. Samuel started school in Caldwell Creek in the fall of 1886 and turned out to be, to no one's great surprise, a child who read voraciously and who had opinions. Clara, who was walking by the time she was 11 months old with the confidence of a person who intended to be underestimated and resented it, developed into an animal person, as intense in her focus on the horses and the cattle dog and the various cats that had taken up residence in the barn as her mother had once been in her focus on books and numbers. Edith's accounting work had grown over these years into something that was, without her exactly planning it that way, a small business. She had 6 clients in the area now, ranches and the general store and the livery, and she managed their books with the same meticulous care she brought to the Stone Ranch's own finances. This brought in enough to be genuinely significant, and she had begun, in 1886, putting some of it aside with a specific purpose. She had been teaching Samuel at home on the evenings when the school curriculum fell short, which it often did, and she had been thinking about the school in Caldwell Creek, which was underfunded and operating out of a building that was in a poor state of repair. She mentioned this to Charles one evening in the fall of 1886, that the school needed help, that she had an idea. He listened. He asked questions. He looked at her numbers, which she had already assembled because she was Edith, and this was what she did. "You want to endow the school," he said. "I want to help build them a proper building," she said. "The current one is not suitable. The floor is uneven and there is no proper insulation, and in winter the children are cold. And you have been setting money aside for this." "For 2 years," she admitted. He was quiet for a moment. "How much more do you need?" she told him. He matched it, without discussion, without negotiation, without anything except the simple recognition that this was what she wanted to do with their resources, and he agreed it was a good thing to do. It was one of the things she loved most about him, that his generosity was never performed and never required the other person to feel grateful for it. He gave as simply as he breathed. The new school building opened in the spring of 1887. It was a proper structure with a good floor and proper windows, and enough space for the number of students Caldwell Creek actually had, rather than the number it had when the original building was put up in 1873. The schoolteacher, A young man from Ohio named Everett Burke, who had arrived the previous year, had ideas that were considerably more sophisticated than the previous teachers, and Samuel took to him immediately in the way that certain children take to certain teachers, with an intensity of attention that tells you everything about both the student and the educator. Edith attended the opening ceremony for the building and stood in the back while the mayor of Caldwell Creek, a man named Horatio Downs who had a great gift for the extended remark, spoke at some length about the generosity of the community. Charles stood beside her and at one point took her hand without looking at her, just quietly, in the middle of the mayor's third paragraph, and she held it and thought that she had been right about everything that mattered. In the summer of 1887, Edith found out she was expecting a third time. She was 30 years old now, and she received this news with the calm of someone who had done this before and knew what it entailed. She was also, she admitted to herself privately, very happy about it. The house was large enough, the ranch was doing well, and she had Rose's help on the days when her body was being unreasonable. Charles received the news across the dinner table, as was their established tradition for important announcements, and the smile appeared, unguarded and complete. "Samuel will be proud," he said. "Samuel will give the baby a full assessment within the first 5 minutes and assign it a status," she said. "Clara will try to teach it to talk to the horses," he said. "Clara will try to teach it to ride before it can walk," she said. They looked at each other and she started laughing, and he did too, and Samuel, who was 7 and very accustomed to adults doing incomprehensible things, went back to eating his supper with the patience of someone who had learned to wait it out. The third baby arrived in February of 1888, in the cold, but with the particular dramatic timing that had become something of a family tradition. Another boy, they named him James, after Edith's father. He was a quieter child than his siblings had been, observant in the way of people who are paying attention to more than they show, and he had Charles's eyes and Charles's way of going still when he was thinking, which Edith recognized from his very first week of life, and which filled her with an affection so specific it almost ached. The Stone Ranch by 1888 was a well-known and well-regarded operation in the county. Charles had developed a reputation for running a fair and well-managed property, for treating his workers properly, and for being the kind of man who could be relied upon to do what he said he would do, which was, in the Wyoming territory of the 1880s, not as common as it should have been. Edith was known throughout the county as a sharp woman with numbers and a formidable capacity for seeing through anything that did not quite add up, financially or otherwise. They were invited to the Territorial Fair in Cheyenne in August of 1888, a 3-day event that brought ranchers and businesspeople and politicians from across Wyoming together in the way that such gatherings do, with a great deal of handshaking and public optimism, and the particular hopefulness of a territory that was about to become a state. Wyoming was approaching statehood with the confidence of a place that knew something about itself, not least of which was that it had granted women the right to vote as far back as 1869, which was something Edith found significant and worth noting every time someone seemed to imagine that the frontier was entirely without principle. Charles and Edith went to the fair, leaving Samuel and Clara with Rose and Granger, and James, who was 6 months old and needed his mother, came along. It was, despite its practical purposes, something close to an adventure. They stayed in a proper hotel for 2 nights, which was a luxury they rarely indulged, and ate dinner at a restaurant where someone else did the cooking, and walked through the fair exhibits in the summer evening with James asleep in Edith's arms. And it was, she thought, perfect in the way that specific evenings sometimes are, when everything is exactly right, and you are aware of it while it is happening rather than only in retrospect. Charles bought her a brooch at a craftsman's stall. It was not expensive and it was not particularly fashionable, but it was a small silver thing in the shape of a sunflower, and when he held it out, she understood immediately that he had been paying attention to the sunflowers since the beginning, and had simply never said so. She pinned it to her dress and wore it for the rest of the fair. In November of 1889, Wyoming became a state. Charles and Edith celebrated this in the way they celebrated most things, without excessive ceremony but with a genuine sense that it mattered, sitting in the parlor in the evening with the children asleep upstairs and Colonel, who was aging now but still comfortable in his place by the fire, stretched out on the rug. They drank a glass of wine, a bottle Charles had been keeping since the previous Christmas, and talked about the territory they had come to when it was a territory and what it was becoming. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her, "coming here?" She thought about it seriously, which he would have expected because she always thought about things seriously. "I regret the 6 months in Denver," she said. "I don't regret a single day before or after." He was quiet for a moment. "I should tell you," he said, with the careful tone that meant he was about to say something he had been sitting with for a long time, "that the day you walked back through that gate asking if the offer still stood, I was more frightened than I have been in my adult life." "Frightened of what?" "Of having the wrong answer, of saying something that would make you turn around again." He looked at her. "There is not a version of that morning in which the offer was not still standing. I want you to know that. It was never a question." Edith set down her wine glass. She had heard those words before, the first time he had said them, standing in the January cold with everything she had between them. But hearing him say this now, in the warmth of the house they had built together, with 3 children upstairs and 7 years of their life between that January morning and this November evening, she felt them differently. Not as a rescue or a mercy, but as what they actually were, a constant, something that had not wavered once. "I know," she said. "I know that now." He reached over and took her hand. Outside, Wyoming was a state, and the wind was doing the thing it did in November across the open plains, and the cattle were settled, and upstairs Samuel was asleep over a book. She was almost certain of it, and Clara had probably smuggled one of the barn cats into her bed again, and James was breathing steadily in his crib with all the peaceful certainty of a small person who had never once doubted he was exactly where he belonged. Charles held her hand, and she held his, and the fire went on burning. By the spring of 1890, Edith had expanded her accounting practice to include 3 ranches in the next county, which required a monthly trip on horseback that she found she genuinely enjoyed, partly for the work, and partly because she liked the feeling of moving through the Wyoming landscape on a horse she knew well, with the sky above her and the land spreading in every direction. She had become, without quite intending it, a confident horsewoman. The boots had been replaced, first with a proper pair purchased in Caldwell Creek, and then with a pair Charles had commissioned from a cobbler in Cheyenne as a birthday gift, and they were the finest things she owned, and she wore them nearly every day. The sunflower brooch was worn on Sundays and on important occasions, and had become something the children associated with their mother's dressed-up self, the way children absorb small symbols and hold them without knowing why. Samuel, at 10, was the kind of student that teachers mention to each other in whispers, the kind who reads everything, and then comes back with questions that require the teacher to have read more than they initially intended. Everett Burke, the schoolteacher, had taken to lending Samuel books from his own collection, which Charles and Edith discussed carefully, because they wanted to encourage it but also wanted Samuel to understand that the books were borrowed, not owned, and that the care of borrowed things was a form of respect. Clara, at 8, had a talent with horses that was becoming impossible to ignore. Granger had recognized it first and told Charles, and Charles had told Edith, and Edith had watched her daughter work with the horses with the specific attention of a woman who does not intend to let something real go unnoticed. She was going to need proper training. They were already thinking about who could provide it. James, at 2, was the philosopher of the family. He watched everything from a position of great stillness and communicated in complete, precise sentences when he decided to communicate at all. He had told Edith at breakfast one Tuesday morning that the cat in the barn had a sad face and needed something. She had gone to look and found that the cat had, in fact, injured a paw and was hiding it. She had told Charles about this, and Charles had been quiet for a moment, and then said that James was going to be either a very good rancher or a very good doctor. Colonel died in the fall of 1890, quietly, beside the fire where he always slept, old and content, and surrounded by the family he had watched accumulate around his person over the years. Samuel wept openly, which Edith let him do without any attempt to minimize it, because grief was real and Colonel had been a real thing worth grieving. Charles buried him near the kitchen garden, which Edith thought was fitting, and put a small stone marker there. She planted sunflowers around it the following spring. 1991 brought a new cattle dog, a young female that Clara named Scout, and that showed within the first 2 weeks that she was going to be as good at the work as Colonel had been. The naming of the dog was a formal family occasion, and James had suggested the name with the brevity and conviction that characterized all his contributions to family discussions. Granger and Rose had a child of their own by 1891, a boy they named Henry, who arrived with the same enthusiasm for existence that most first children seem to bring to the undertaking. Rose came to Edith 2 days after Henry was born, holding him with the careful wonder of a first-time mother, and Edith sat beside her on the bed in Rose's house and thought about the step outside the general store in Caldwell Creek, and how much had grown from a moment of simply paying attention. On their 10th wedding anniversary in September of 1892, Charles and Edith rode out to the North Ridge in the late afternoon. It was the ridge he had pointed out to her on their first drive to the ranch, the one where the cattle sometimes drifted if the fence line was not right. They had left the children with Rose and ridden up through the good grass to where the land spread out in every direction in the particular light that late September makes, golden and long and somehow both ending and beginning at the same time. They sat on the ridge with their horses ground-tied and the whole of the country around them. Below, the ranch house was visible, and the barn and the kitchen garden with the sunflowers gone to seed now, and the small mark of Colonel's stone. 10 years, she said. 11 if you count the letters, he said. She laughed. The letters were different. They weren't, he said. I have been in love with you since the second letter. She turned to look at him. She had not known that, or perhaps she had known it in the way she knew things that she was not ready to examine directly. The second one. You told me in the second letter that you had read 3 of the same books I mentioned in mine and had disagreed strongly with the conclusions of 2 of them, he said. And I thought, this woman is exactly who I have been looking for. She felt that in her chest, that warmth that had been building in her since a January morning 9.5 years ago, since the gate and the dust and the careful question and the answer that had never once wavered. She took off her glove and took his hand, bare palm to bare palm, out there on the ridge with Wyoming spreading away in every direction. I am so glad, she said, that I wrote that letter. I am glad you wrote it every day, he said. They sat on the ridge until the light changed and the evening began to come in from the east, and then they rode back down to the ranch house where the lights were on, and the smell of supper was coming from Rose's good cooking, and Samuel's voice could be heard asking something that Clara was loudly declining to answer, and James was, no doubt, watching the whole scene with his particular quiet attention. Charles held the gate for her as she rode in. She passed through and looked back at him in the evening light and thought that this was everything. Not everything she had planned for, not the practical arrangement she had written that first letter about, but everything that mattered, everything that was real, everything that could be trusted to hold in the coldest winter and the hardest season and the longest distance. He looked back at her with those dark eyes and that expression she had been cataloging since the beginning, the one that showed all the way through him when he forgot to keep it back. She smiled. He smiled. And the gate swung closed behind them both, and the lights of the stone ranch were warm in the Wyoming evening, and the sky above the plains was enormous and full of stars, the way it always was, the way it had been before either of them arrived and would be long after, vast and clear and indifferent to the particular smallness of human hearts, except that human hearts were not small, she thought, They were exactly the size of everything that mattered to them, which was, in Edith Stone's case, quite large indeed. Inside, Samuel was helping Rose set the table with the methodical conscientiousness of a 10-year-old who had been told this was his responsibility. Clara was coming in from the barn with a smear of something on her face that Edith was not going to inquire about directly. James was sitting very still at the edge of the table, watching Henry learn to pull himself upright against a chair leg, with the expression of a small person witnessing something worth recording. Edith came in and took off her hat and hung it on the hook by the door, the hook that Charles had put there in the first month because she had said she always forgot where she put her hat, and he had, without comment, put a hook there for it. And then she went to the stove to help with supper, and Charles came in behind her and washed at the basin, and Samuel started telling everyone about something he had read that day, and Clara said something that made Granger laugh, and James said, with his customary precision, "Henry is going to fall." And Henry did fall softly onto his padded bottom, and everyone laughed, and Henry, undiscouraged, immediately began pulling himself upright again. This was a Thursday evening in September of 1892 on the Stone Ranch in Caldwell Creek, Wyoming. It was not a remarkable evening in the sense of history. Nothing was decided here that affected the course of the territory or the nation. No important men rode through. No great events were recorded. But Edith Stone, born Edith Grayson, who had crossed 1,000 miles with $42 in one trunk, and a worn pair of boots and a letter in her carpet bag, stood at the stove in the kitchen she had reorganized in her first week, and watched her family occupy the room with all the noise and warmth and continuous motion that life at its best is made of, and felt, with the kind of certainty that does not need to be said out loud because it is simply true, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and had been, ever since the morning she walked through a gate in the January cold and asked a man if his offer still stood. It had never once stopped standing, and neither, she thought, had she.